A thin layer of late afternoon sunlight spread across my kitchen floor, giving the illusion of warmth, even though everything felt cold inside. I stood there, my phone buzzing softly on the counter, and I knew without looking who was messaging me again. The sound set my teeth on edge. 17 years since I last cared about their emotional landscape, yet here we were, connected through a digital line I couldn't afford to sever. I tapped my nails against the countertop, considering whether to read her messages now or later. Eventually, I sighed and picked up the phone. Sure enough, there were more voice notes, long, breathy audios from my ex-husband's wife. The same woman who had once been the other woman, who had knowingly slept with him while I was at home, heavily pregnant with our daughter. The same woman who had married him afterward, fully aware of what kind of man he was. Yet now that he'd cheated on her too, she suddenly needed me to understand, to listen, to be some sort of confidant. It was absurd. For nearly 2 decades, our only communications had been a sparse exchange of texts whenever I needed to confirm details about my daughter's weekend stays. She'd always been distant, barely polite, which suited me just fine. I didn't want to befriend her. I didn't need her pity or her company. When the affair happened all those years ago, I'd chosen to move on. I learned from his betrayal, accepted that he preferred another woman's bed, and decided that a healthy co-parenting arrangement mattered more than winning him back. I wasn't going to fight for a man who looked me in the eye and said our marriage was a mistake. I'd never forget how he dismissed me as boring in bed and praised her for valuing him properly. He was free to go, and I was free to rebuild a life without him. I was young then, vulnerable, desperately trying to raise my daughter in stability. Now, older and with more confidence, I cherished the peace I had carved out. The last thing I needed was to play therapist to the woman who had contributed to my heartbreak, who'd never once tried to warn me or apologize. And yet, she sent message after message, day after day, talking about how it felt to be betrayed, how she never saw it coming, how she thought she was special. All these years, she'd shown little interest in bonding, but now that the tables had turned, she thought we could form some twisted sorority of scorned wives. I listened to a snippet of her latest audio and grimaced. Her voice was tearful, pleading, yet somehow still self-centered. "You know how I feel now," she said softly. Her words landed hollow. Did she truly expect me to confirm her pain, as if my own experience was just a training manual on surviving infidelity? Did she think this was some cosmic payback that I should celebrate with her? I tried to remember how it felt back then, when I discovered my husband's affair. But 17 years is a long time. I'd long since processed it, archived the pain, and moved on. Comparing her current agony to my past suffering felt pointless. Our situations were never the same. When my ex cheated on me, I was postpartum, at my most vulnerable, and he callously left me for her. She chose to marry him afterward. She knew what kind of man he was. She had all the evidence she needed. Still, she jumped into a marriage with him. In some bizarre corner of her mind, maybe she thought she could tame him, or that she was inherently more desirable than I had been. Now he'd done to her exactly what he'd done to me. I couldn't find it in myself to care much. Not that I wished her harm. I simply had no emotional resources to spare for her heartbreak. I had spent them all years ago, dragging myself out of the pit he'd kicked me into. It wasn't just her, though. It was everyone else. Friends and family members kept urging me to be more understanding. My mother, my relatives, my liberal-minded friends who preached perpetual empathy, my acquaintances who didn't know the full story, all of them chiding me to be kinder to a fellow woman in pain. They made it sound like a moral failing that I didn't want to comfort someone who had contributed to my misery. They insisted it wasn't her fault he cheated back then. They said she must feel lonely. As if I'd never felt loneliness. As if I had to become a saint, forever cradling wounded birds, even the ones who had once broken my wings. Their arguments circled the same drain. It's not her fault he's a cheater. Sure, but she was never honest with me, never tried to protect me from learning the truth the hard way. She actively participated in the affair that ended my marriage. She could have warned me, apologized, even shown a smidge of remorse at some point. Instead, she got what she wanted, my husband. And now, years later, she wanted sympathy from me. I found the irony thick and bitter. I couldn't block her either, because I needed a means of communication in case something happened with my daughter while she was at their house. Our teen now moved comfortably between our two homes, and I wouldn't jeopardize that. So I was stuck. Her number sat in my phone, a lingering channel of unwelcome confessionals and teary monologues I never asked for. One evening, after a long day at work, I finally snapped. The relentless drip of her audios, the exhausting pressure from others to be the bigger person, wore me down. I recorded my own audio response, voice steady, no trembling. I told her I didn't care about her journey or struggle. We weren't friends, and I didn't want to be. She had never apologized, never acknowledged the role she played in my past suffering, and now she wanted a shoulder to cry on? No. I laid it all out. When I was newly postpartum, her lover, my husband, shattered my world, and she was complicit. She could not now rewrite history to cast us as allies. I let it all spill out. A full 5 minutes of pent-up frustration, clarity, and a refusal to indulge her narrative. We argued afterward, of course. She acted outraged and hurt. But what did she expect? That we would form a support group, swap notes on how it feels to be cheated on by the same man? She tried to twist it into some moral failing on my part, as if I were mean or cruel for not wanting to bond over trauma. But I stood firm. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with calm detachment. I'd spent too many years rebuilding myself from the ashes of my former marriage to let her drag me into her drama now. After that heated exchange, I sent a message to my ex-husband, attaching one of her voice notes. I told him to handle his wife. I didn't want to be caught in their marital crisis. He had always been the problem anyway, yet somehow I was being roped in. He apologized. Too little, too late, in a voice that suggested discomfort rather than remorse. He said they were working on their marriage, going to some online workshops about surviving infidelity. I almost laughed. They were a perfect pair, him, a chronic cheater, and her, someone who entered his life as the other woman and now wanted my sympathy because she discovered he wasn't faithful. To my relief, he said he'd talk to her. The next few days passed peacefully. The only text I received from her afterward was a single line. "Your daughter is sleeping here tonight." Perfect. That's all I needed. Simple, neutral information. No appeals for connection, no invitations to share her pain. The silence felt like victory. I still got flack from my family and some friends who insisted I should have been more empathetic. They talked about feminism, about the need for women to support one another, but I saw no reason to force a sisterhood that never existed. She had choices back then. I had choices now. We were not two innocent bystanders who'd been cheated on. We were different people with different histories, and I'd be damned if I let anyone guilt me into offering emotional labor to someone who never cared about my well-being in the first place. I couldn't control what others thought of my stance. Maybe they found me heartless, maybe they thought I was a bad feminist. Let them talk. I wasn't obliged to uphold their version of solidarity, especially for someone who once thrived on my misery. I knew my worth. I knew how long and hard I'd fought to find peace. I wouldn't trade that peace now just so another adult, fully aware of what she'd married into, could offload her regrets onto me. By the end of the week, I felt lighter. My daughter was safe and happy, blissfully unbothered by the drama. My ex and his wife would continue their strange waltz of betrayal and forgiveness. And me? I'd live my life free from their burdens, their expectations, and their attempts to draft me into their personal soap opera. Let them figure it out. I owed them nothing more than basic civility for the sake of my child. I turned off my phone's notifications and stepped outside to enjoy the late autumn air. The trees had begun to drop their leaves, and the world moved on with its usual rhythm. Maybe they'd resolved their problems. maybe they wouldn't. It wasn't my story to tell, just a passing subplot I refused to rewrite. I breathed deeply, relieved to be done with it, content in my decision, and savoring the quiet I had earned long ago.